Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of Mr. American's Moments in History, U.S. History Edition. I am your host, Mr. American. Today, we're going to continue looking at the North and the South, and in particular, today, we're going to look at people and some of the social issues that are facing the North, including the image that we're looking at today. So, we're going to see the rise of a political party called the Know Nothing Party, which is fueled by this phenomenon that we call nativism. And nativists, who are people who believed that um, immigrants posed a threat to the United States, as you can see here by this image, they believed that they needed to be aware of foreign influences. And so they were very much fearful of what immigrants would do as they came to the United States. And so that's kind of where we're going to be looking at today. And so our first learning target, so we're going to be able to explain how many workers in the mid 1800s saw a need for reform in working conditions. And part of this, of course, is the fact that we're seeing um, some changes in our work in the North, in particular more in industry and the use of more of machines. And so we're going to begin there, and we're going to talk about as more and more immigrants start to make their way to the United States, their experience. And particularly today, we're going to look at European immigrants. And so between 1820 and 1860, you're going to see that America's manufacturing shifted quite largely from the factory system to the factory system with the use of machines taking over more of the production tasks. And as that is happening, things like safety and the amount of hours that people worked and the conditions that they work in took a little bit of a hit, and they become much more of a major concern for American factory workers. So you're seeing that safety is needing to be taken more seriously. The hours are getting quite long. We haven't gotten to the 8-hour workday yet. And we're also seeing poor working conditions for those who are working sometimes in these factory systems. So this becomes a major concern for American factory workers, and they have to kind of look at what can we do to improve these things. So we're going to talk about some of those tactics today. And one of those tactics that we see, and while they have certainly in more modern U.S. history gained more power, it took a little while for them to develop that. And so trade unions began to organize, and they began to demand more rights for their workers. And just a reminder, trade unions, these are organizations of workers, typically with the same trade or skill. So, throughout the United States, you'll see unions for plumbers and electricians and teachers and um, a variety of different workers, auto workers, people who work for, say, Ford or GM often will form a union. So these are, again, people who work together. There's even nursing unions and other skills in the service industries as well. And so they organized, they demanded rights for their workers, and they even went so far as to stage strikes. And a strike is when you stop the working by your workers to force an employer to meet demands when it was necessary to put pressure on employers. And so the idea behind these trade unions was that as a whole, the voice would be much larger and more likely to be heard and to have something done than with just individuals. And certainly, this is where unions continue to drive their power, is in their numbers. And so, again, the idea was to put pressure on employers. And so I would encourage you to think about how going on strike puts that pressure on employers, um, regardless of the union. It certainly plays an important role. So if you need to pause and think about it, by all means, I want you to think about it. Though. So certainly in its early years, we can see here a march for a strike of workers. But as we go through history, we can see that unions certainly have put more emphasis on working conditions and While many unions, including the one you guys see here with the teachers union in Chicago, they didn't want to go on strike. They felt it was in the best interest of themselves and their students. So looking at these northern factories throughout the North, we're going to see that largely slavery um, had been, largely free of, or excuse me, the North had been largely free of slavery by the time we get to about the 1830s. It doesn't mean that it doesn't exist in the North, but you certainly see that it's beyond the majority or even the norm. So that being said, in the North, you're still going to see two things occurring. And these are prejudice and discrimination. These two things remain. And it's actually very important that we define these terms because uh, even today we see these as issues for our country moving forward. So prejudice has more to do with the mindset. It's usually an unfair opinion that's not based on facts. And prejudice goes hand in hand with things like stereotypes. And so prejudice plays a really is kind of a starting point for discrimination. So discrimination is the unfair treatment, and that usually comes from some sort of prejudice. But discrimination is the unfair treatment of a group, an unequal treatment based on a variety of different factors, and this certainly is by no means a complete list, but they can be things like a person's race, their religion, their ethnic background, their place of birth. Certainly, we could look at a variety of different factors today, including things like a person's gender, sexual orientation, or um, other identifying factors of what makes them who they are. And so, very few African Americans were allowed to vote. Actually, another thing that most communities in the North also didn't allow is that free African Americans did not attend public schools. And so the education of African Americans in the North at this point needed to be done privately. And you will see throughout history that this is then where we start to see historically black colleges and universities start to develop as a way to combat that lack of access. So certainly, uh, while slavery is certainly less of an issue, you still see the undertones of unequal treatment through prejudice and discrimination for African Americans. Certainly, some African Americans did become successful in business. We certainly have people like Henry Boyd and Samuel Cornish, along with John B. Westrom, and certainly all of these men were quite successful for the time, and they did defy the odds. But unfortunately, they're not the norm. They are exceptions to the rules. Um, Bacon B. Allen also became the first African American licensed to practice law in the United States. And it's also important that as we talk about discrimination and prejudice, that we discuss other groups of people, including women, who received less pay than men, um, and often were excluded from unions. So were African Americans at the time. Sarah G. Bagley is a great example. She helped to pave the way for protection for female workers. So these groups that faced more prejudice and discrimination had to band together to really um, essentially hold on to their place in society and attempt to make some changes towards the future. So, when we think about what prompted workers originally to organize their trade union, our options here include steadily worsening conditions um, and poor pay. There are too many immigrants taking factory jobs, discrimination against women and African Americans in the workplace, or the rise of the Know Nothing Party. So take a moment, think about that. We'll give your answer here in a moment. But which one of those prompted the organization of trade unions? And again, pause the video if you need to, but looking forward, it was the steady working conditions, poor pay, longer hours, lack of safety that originally prompted workers to organize into trade unions. For the second half here, I want to talk a little bit about European immigrants facing hardship and discrimination. You're going to see a big wave of immigrants in the early 1800s, primarily from two places, Ireland and Germany. And they're going to face a lot of discrimination when they make their way to the United States. So, like I said, many people flock to the East Coast cities because there were factory workers here, or factory work here, and this is also where there was economic opportunity. Um, One of the things that we would note in world history is the potato famine, or the famine in Ireland, between, in the early 1840s, 1850s. And we define famine as an extreme shortage of food. And this brought about 1.5 million Irish immigrants to the United States between 1847 and 1860, including some of my ancestors who came during this time period. And they're going to be the largest group. The second largest group is going to be the Germans during this point. And certainly we could get into a long discussion about how what Germany has been throughout world history has changed. And so even though Germans make up the largest European, or the largest ethnic group that European Americans um, claim ancestry from, you could make an argument certainly that what Germany is and has been throughout history has changed significantly. But many Germans come, including some of my ancestors that settled in the Midwest and certainly in the Western territories. They're much more likely to go than the Irish, originally anyway, the Midwest. So when we look at the sources of immigration, again, the two overwhelming majorities, Ireland, right there, but in about a 20-year span, make up close to 40%, and Germany makes up about 32%. You're still seeing certainly British immigrants making up about 16% of that time, but you can see that all the other nations make up the last about 13%, give or take. And so, even looking at our bar graph, you can see that a lot of immigration coincides um, with Germans wanting to escape mandatory military service, and during wars in Prussia and Germany, and then of course the Irish with the famine. So when immigrants came to the United States, they certainly brought with them new languages, new cultures, new religions, and particularly with the Germans and the Irish, much more Catholics. And so they brought those traditions with them to the United States, but they weren't necessarily opened or welcomed with open arms by everybody. And so immigrants faced a lot of discrimination from a group called nativists. And these are people, or a person who favors those who are born within the United States or within their own country, as opposed to immigrants, because they fear the newcomers would take jobs from American-born citizens and bring in outside influence. And certainly a fear of that Catholic tradition in the case of the Irish and the Germans. And so you see the American Party, also known as the Know Nothing Party, called for much stricter citizenship laws and quotas and caps on the amount of immigrants that could come into the United States. And they're called the Know Nothing Party because when you ask them what they knew about the party, they would say they know nothing. And so we again sometimes call the American Party the Know Nothing Party. And looking at our options here, is its opponents believed the party members knew nothing about the important issues. We have party members did not support education. Party members responded to questions about the group by saying, I know nothing. Or party members were mainly Catholics who knew nothing about Protestantism. And so our best answer here is certainly C. It's again the fact that they would say they knew nothing. In fact, with D, they were actually mainly Protestant as opposed to knowing perhaps less about Catholicism. And so, ladies and gentlemen, that's going to wrap up this edition of Mr. Merrigan's Moments in History. A little bit longer edition, but I appreciate you listening. A very important topic in the context of our current history. And so understanding the differences between prejudice and discrimination is very important for us as a society today. So for my students, make sure that you've been following along with the guided reading. or excuse me, guided notes, and make sure you ask me any questions that you have. For those of you who are just joining